Single dad and his two daughters find an injured woman by the roadside. They had no idea she was a millionaire. The Kansas sky was turning gold at the edges when Ethan Cole first saw the wrecked sedan half buried in the ditch along Route 9. Its front end crumpled against a fence post, steam curling faintly from beneath the hood. He slowed the truck immediately, gravel crunching under the tires. His two daughters, Nia, 8, and Sophie, 7, sitting up straighter in the back seat. "Dad, is someone in there?" Nia asked, her voice tight. "Stay in the truck," Ethan said, already unbuckling. "Both of you." "I mean it." Ethan Cole was 39, a widowed farmer who'd been running 400 acres of wheat and soybeans alone since his wife Carol died 2 years earlier. Cancer, fast and merciless, the same way it always seemed to take the people who least deserved it. He raised Nia and Sophie, mostly by instinct now. Girls he and Carol had adopted 6 years apart from the same foster family. Sisters bonded by circumstance who'd become, in every way that mattered, simply his daughters. Life on the farm hadn't left Ethan with much time for anything beyond crops, chores, and homework help. But it had left him with something else, a steady, unshakable instinct to stop when something looked wrong, because he'd learned the hard way that the world didn't always give you a second chance to help. He climbed down into the ditch and found her a few yards from the wreck, half collapsed against the wooden fence line separating his property from the road. Her white blouse streaked with dirt and blood, a nasty gash above her eyebrow, her breathing shallow but steady. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Ethan knelt beside her, careful not to move her neck. "I need you to stay still. I'm calling for help right now." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused for a moment, before locking onto his face. "The car," she murmured. "I swerved, there was a deer." "Don't worry about the car," Ethan said gently, already dialing 911 with one hand while checking her pulse with the other. An old habit from a stint as a volunteer firefighter, years before Carol's diagnosis, had pulled him away from everything but the farm and his girls. "You're safe now." "What's your name?" "Vivian," she said weakly. "Vivian Marsh." The ambulance took nearly 25 minutes to arrive. Rural response times being what they were, out where Ethan's farm sat 40 minutes from the nearest hospital. In that time, Ethan kept Vivian talking, kept her conscious, wrapped his own flannel jacket around her shoulders against the evening chill, and reassured his daughters, who had, despite his instructions, crept partway down the ditch, watching with wide, solemn eyes that the woman was going to be okay. "Is she gonna die?" Sophie whispered, tugging at Ethan's sleeve. "No, baby," Ethan said, keeping his voice calm even as his own pulse hammered with adrenaline. "She's hurt, but she's talking, and that's a good sign. She's going to be just fine." Vivian, despite her pain, managed a faint, grateful smile toward the two girls peering down at her. "Your daughters?" she asked Ethan. "Yes, ma'am. They're sweet," Vivian said, wincing as she shifted slightly. "Thank you for stopping. Most people on a road like this probably just drive past." "Not around here," Ethan said simply. "Not on my watch anyway." Vivian Marsh spent 4 days at the regional hospital, a mild concussion, 2 fractured ribs, and a deep laceration that required stitches. But nothing life-threatening, thanks, in large part, the attending physician noted, to how quickly help had arrived and how well she'd been monitored before EMS reached the scene. What Ethan didn't know, sitting in the hospital waiting room that first evening after giving his statement to the responding officer, was that Vivian Marsh wasn't simply a woman passing through rural Kansas on her way to visit an old college friend, as she'd told the officer. She was the founder and CEO of Marsh Renewable Group, a clean energy investment firm headquartered in Chicago, with a personal net worth north of $80 million and a professional reputation for being sharp, guarded, and famously private about her personal life. She'd been driving alone that evening, no assistant, no security detail. Nothing that would have identified her specifically, because she'd wanted a few days completely off the radar, away from board meetings and investor calls, and the particular exhaustion that came from being responsible. Always, for other people's money and expectations, she hadn't expected to end up in a ditch. She certainly hadn't expected to be pulled out of it by a farmer, with dirt under his fingernails, and 2 solemn-eyed little girls watching from the fence line. Ethan visited the hospital twice more before Vivian was discharged, not out of any expectation, but because that was simply who he was. The kind of man who finished what he started, who didn't consider a rescue complete just because the ambulance had arrived. He brought Vivian a small bouquet of wildflowers the second time, picked from the edge of his own property, apologizing awkwardly that it wasn't much of anything. Really, it's more than most people would think to do, Vivian said, genuinely touched, turning the flowers slowly in her hands. Ethan, can I ask you something? Why did you stop? Really, most people would have called it in and kept driving. Ethan considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. My wife used to say the measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone's watching, he said finally. It's what they do in the 10 seconds before they decide whether to stop the truck or keep driving. Nobody was going to know either way, out on that road. Felt like an easy decision to me. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. I don't think I've had someone talk to me like that in a very long time, she admitted. Most people in my life calculate. Every decision has an angle, an ask behind it eventually. It's strange, and honestly kind of wonderful, to meet someone who just stopped because it was right. When Vivian was finally discharged, her car totaled beyond repair. She found herself facing a 2-day wait before a rental could be arranged in the small county seat, with no family nearby and a business trip back to Chicago that suddenly felt very far away. Ethan, without a second thought, offered his farmhouse's guest room. You don't have to do that, Vivian said, though the exhaustion in her voice suggested she was hoping he'd insist. I know I don't have to, Ethan said. Naya and Sophie already asked if you could stay for dinner. If I send you off to some motel by the highway with 2 fractured ribs, I'll never hear the end of it. Those 2 days turned into 4. Vivian, restless and unused to stillness, found herself first watching, then helping, as Ethan and the girls moved through the small, steady rhythms of farm life, feeding the chickens, mending a section of fence, sitting down to simple dinners where Sophie insisted on saying an elaborate grace before every meal, and Naya peppered Vivian with questions about what Chicago skyscrapers looked like up close. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Vivian wasn't checking her phone every 4 minutes. She wasn't managing a crisis, calming an anxious investor, or rehearsing a difficult board conversation in her head at 2 inches the morning. She was simply present, helping Sophie with a jigsaw puzzle at the kitchen table, listening to Ethan talk quietly about Carol, about the 2 years of grief he'd worked through mostly alone, about how the farm and the girls had become the only things that made sense in a world that had otherwise fallen apart around him. You built all this out of loss, Vivian said one evening, watching the sun set gold over the wheat fields from the porch. I built my company out of ambition. I used to think ambition was the harder thing to sustain. I'm starting to think I had that backwards. By the time Vivian's rental car finally arrived, something had shifted quietly between them, not dramatic, not rushed, but real. The way trust builds slowly between 2 people who've seen each other at their most unguarded. Before she left, Vivian sat down with Ethan at the kitchen table and, for the first time, told him the truth about who she really was. Ethan listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he simply said, "Doesn't change anything, as far as I'm concerned. You were a person bleeding by my fence line. That's who I stopped for. Not somebody's balance sheet." I know, Vivian said. That's exactly why I wanted you to know before I left. Because you're the first person in a long time who genuinely wouldn't have cared either way. She left that afternoon, but not before quietly arranging, through her foundation, an anonymous scholarship fund for the county's small rural school, the same school Naya and Sophie attended, and not before promising, sincerely, that this wasn't goodbye, just a pause. Over the following months, what began as occasional phone calls slowly became weekly ones. Then visits, Vivian flying out for long weekends, then extended stays, learning to drive Ethan's old pickup down the gravel roads, learning the names of his cattle, letting Sophie braid small wildflowers into her hair on the porch, while Naya explained, in exhaustive detail, the entire plot of her favorite book series. A year later, Marsh Renewable Group announced a significant new agricultural sustainability initiative, funding solar infrastructure for small family farms across 3 states a project. Insiders noted that Vivian herself had proposed personally, inspired. She told a business journal without elaborating further. By people who taught me that the most valuable investments aren't always measured in dollars. Ethan never asked for anything, never once let the growing relationship change how he lived or how he raised his daughters. And that, more than anything else, was exactly why Vivian Marsh, a woman who'd spent 15 years surrounded by people chasing her money, finally, quietly, let herself fall in love with a man who'd never once cared what she was worth, only who she was. "You saved my life on that road," Vivian told him one evening, nearly 2 years after the accident, sitting on the same porch where it had all started, Nia and Sophie asleep inside. "But honestly, Ethan, I think you saved a lot more than that." Ethan just smiled, reaching for her hand the way he had that very first evening, kneeling beside her in the ditch, certain of exactly one thing, that some people are worth stopping for. Long before you ever learn their name. The end.